Picture this. You're in a boardroom. The walls are lined with degrees. The table is surrounded by polished shoes, crisp suits, confident smiles, people who've mastered the system. Then someone speaks. A younger voice, perhaps less formally dressed, asks a question that cuts deeper than anyone expected. Not a rude question, not even a confrontational one, but a question that challenges the very premise everyone in that room has built their identity around. And suddenly, everything changes. The room freezes. People glance at each other, unsure how to respond. Someone clears their throat. Another shifts in their seat, but no one answers. Not because the question was foolish, but because it was too honest. Someone clears their throat. Another shifts in their seat, but no one answers. Not because the question was foolish, but because it was too honest. You witnessed the most ancient threat to any elite group, the presence of a mind that cannot be tamed, the self-educated individual. Because make no mistake, the self-educated don't unsettle the elite because they lack credentials. They unsettle the elite because they lack dependency. They are not bound by the same gatekeepers, not validated by the same institutions, not shaped by the same invisible hands that train people to think inside acceptable limits. They move differently. They ask questions no curriculum would dare include. They think with a kind of freedom that can't be bought, bribed, or bullied. And that terrifies those who've built their status on conformity disguised as excellence. Niccolò Machiavelli saw this clearly over 500 years ago. The father of political realism, the master observer of power and its manipulation. He understood something that still makes elites nervous today, that true power doesn't lie in titles or institutions. It lies in the ability to think independently, to see clearly, to question deeply. And anyone who does that without needing permission becomes unpredictable, which, to the powerful, is the most dangerous kind of human being. Let's get one thing straight. In every stable society, knowledge is never neutral. It is curated, filtered, distributed through carefully controlled channels, universities, professional boards, media organizations, government certifications. We're taught that this is simply how society maintains standards. But Machiavelli would laugh at such a naive belief. In The Prince, he argued that rulers should not seek to enlighten the masses, but to control them. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because once people start thinking for themselves, questioning the rules, the structure starts to crack. He warned that if you want peace, you must control the flow of ideas. Not just censor them, but domesticate them. Wrap them in rituals, exams, titles, credentials, so that people forget the difference between real understanding and institutional approval. And that's where the self-educated become such a threat. They bypass all of that. They learn not because they were told to, but because they had to. Their learning is urgent, raw, unpolished, and brutally sincere. They don't follow syllabi. They follow curiosity. They don't aim for degrees. They aim for clarity. And because of that, they often arrive at truths the system would prefer they never touch. This is what makes them uncontrollable. They don't speak the approved language. They don't wear the right academic camouflage. They might lack the polish, but they possess the essence. And when they speak, they expose the uncomfortable gap between knowledge and authority, between wisdom and permission, between real insight and performative expertise. And that, right there, is why the elite cannot stand them. Because the system isn't built to honor those who see clearly. It's built to reward those who obey effectively. It favors consistency over originality, procedure over perception. And if someone walks in without asking for entry, holds up a mirror and says, "None of this makes sense," they don't just threaten decorum. They threaten the foundation. They are the variable the system didn't plan for, the glitch in the matrix, the heretic in the temple of credentials. The elite's discomfort isn't about pride. It's about survival. because every self-educated mind is living proof that their monopoly on knowledge is an illusion, that you don't need their approval to understand reality, that learning doesn't belong to them. And once people realize that, once they understand that wisdom isn't something granted but something grown, the whole hierarchy begins to shake. This is the Machiavellian nightmare, not revolution through violence, but revolution through awareness, through quiet, independent minds who cannot be bought or boxed, through people who've tasted truth without being fed it. And once you've done that, once you've learned without permission, no one can ever truly control you again. And here's where the fear sharpens, because the self-educated don't just consume different knowledge, they ask different questions, the kind of questions that shake pillars. While others ask, how can I climb the ladder? They ask, why does this ladder even matter? In a world obsessed with position, performance, and prestige, they're not looking for a faster way to win the game. They're asking whether the game is worth playing at all. And that, more than anything, is what makes them dangerous. Because in a system designed to reward obedience, questioning the purpose behind the rules isn't seen as curiosity. It's seen as insubordination. It's not that they're rude or rebellious. It's that they don't take assumptions for granted. They don't accept because that's how it works as an answer. They want to know why. Why is success measured this way? Why do we worship titles? Why do we outsource our self-worth to institutions, to approval, to applause? Machiavelli warned about this centuries ago. He understood that every power structure must guard its legitimacy above all else. Not its morality, not its effectiveness, its legitimacy. Because once people start to question whether a king is truly chosen by God, or whether a corporate title truly reflects merit, the entire structure trembles. In The Prince, he made it clear, those who challenge the basis of power itself, who don't just fight for their place within the system, but challenge the system's right to exist, must be discredited, neutralized, or erased, not because they're wrong, but because they're too right. And the self-educated, without even trying, often find themselves in that role, not as revolutionaries, but as clarity makers. They see through the show. They don't need permission to learn, so they don't need permission to think. Their sense of self-worth isn't attached to someone else's stamp of approval. They don't wait for a degree to give them permission to speak. They don't need a title to believe their perspective matters. They build their value from within, and in doing so, they quietly threaten a society that teaches everyone to look outward for validation. That's why the reaction is often so swift and so subtle. They're labeled difficult, not a team player, arrogant, unpolished. They're accused of lacking soft skills, emotional intelligence, cultural fit, anything that can justify the discomfort they cause. But these aren't genuine critiques, they're protective reflexes. They're society's way of saying, we don't know what to do with someone who doesn't need our approval to matter. But it goes even deeper than that. Because the self-educated don't just ask tough questions, they see through the performance. You see, most of us are trained, subtly, relentlessly, to respect authority without inspection, to equate position with wisdom, degree with insight, prestige with truth. But the self-educated never learned that reflex, or if they did, they unlearned it fast. Because their education didn't come with a ceremony, it came with failure, with late nights, with books no one assigned, with ideas no one endorsed, with truths that hurt more than they comforted. They learned from reality, not from rehearsed theory. And that gave them something institutions rarely provide: the ability to see the game while everyone else is still playing their parts. Machiavelli, in one of his most brutally honest observations, wrote that a wise man must know how to act the fool when the moment requires it. He wasn't celebrating deception, he was acknowledging reality. Power demands performance, masks, roles, strategic ignorance. But the self-educated don't just learn how to play roles. They learn to see all the roles. They don't just memorize the script. They realize it's a script. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. And that's where the fear sets in, because those who control the narrative suddenly feel watched, exposed. They realize they're being observed not by someone who wants to take their place, but by someone who no longer believes in the stage itself. And that is infinitely more unsettling. The elite operate within layers of image, of status, of performative confidence. But the self-educated see through those layers, not because they're trying to, but because their minds are trained to look for patterns, inconsistencies, contradictions. It's how they learned. It's how they survived. So when they walk into a room, they don't just hear what's said, they see what's being performed. And that kind of perception feels like a spotlight. It makes people nervous, it makes people defensive. It makes people feel seen in a way they didn't ask for. And here's the tragic part. The self-educated often don't mean to threaten anyone. They don't walk in looking to tear down systems. Most of the time, they're simply trying to understand, to speak honestly, to ask questions. But in a society built on performances, even honesty becomes dangerous. Even curiosity becomes threatening. Even clarity becomes rebellion. So the elite respond not with dialogue, but with dismissal. Not with debate, but with deflection. Not with understanding, but with subtle exile. They whisper that the self-educated are too intense, too cynical, too raw. What they really mean is too awake. Let's get one thing straight. Systems of power don't reward independent thinkers. They reward compliant executors. Not the ones who see the game for what it is, but the ones who play it well. Not the ones who innovate, but the ones who stay within the lines and make the lines look good. Intelligence in itself is not a threat. What is a threat is intelligence that refuses to submit. And that's exactly the kind of intelligence the self-educated bring. In corporations, in politics, in academia, it's not the sharpest minds who rise fastest. It's the safest. The ones who color inside the box. The ones who know how to play the role, speak the jargon, smile at the right time, and never rock the boat. Want to get promoted? Follow protocol. Want to be liked? Don't challenge procedure. Want to rise in the hierarchy? Make the hierarchy feel good about itself. Meanwhile, the self-educated can't help but see inefficiencies. They can't help but question why things are done a certain way. They don't respect systems for their structure. They evaluate them for their function. And when they spot cracks, they don't look away. They ask, why are we still doing it like this? Who is this really serving? What's the cost of our silence? But asking those questions comes at a price, because those benefiting from the current structure don't take kindly to disruption. Machiavelli said it plainly in The Prince. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Innovators, he warned, are hated by those who profit from the old ways. And here's the problem. Self-educated people are natural innovators, not because they want to be rebels, but because they see clearly, and clarity almost always demands change. They're not interested in preserving appearances. They want to fix what's broken. They want to improve what's inefficient. But improvement threatens power because power thrives on predictability. It needs everyone to follow the same rules, ask the same questions, pursue the same goals. That's how the machine runs smoothly. So anyone who steps out of that rhythm, no matter how well-intentioned, becomes a target. And that's the tragic irony. The self-educated, with their insight and initiative, should be treasured. But instead, they're often silenced, or sidelined, or subtly pushed out. Not because they're wrong, but because they don't submit. And in the game of power, submission matters more than brilliance. But there's something even more unforgivable than disobedience. Something that makes the self-educated not just difficult, but dangerous. It's this: They don't need the system at all. They don't chase titles to feel validated. They don't beg for credentials to be taken seriously. They don't wait for permission to create, to speak, to lead. They just do it. And that independence, that raw, unapologetic autonomy, is something power structures cannot tolerate. Because it threatens their very foundation. Think about it. What keeps a system stable? Dependency. People need to believe they can't succeed without the system, that they can't learn without formal education, that they can't lead without approval, that they can't matter without validation. But the self-educated prove the opposite. Look at the modern world. The founders of world-changing startups, many of them never finished college. The artists whose work shakes culture, often self-taught. The thinkers who challenge mainstream narratives, they operate outside the academy. These people aren't just exceptions. They're proof that the gatekeepers are not the gods they pretend to be. And that proof is intolerable, because it raises dangerous questions in the minds of everyone else. If they did it without the system, why can't I? If they found a path to meaning, to mastery, to impact, without going through the prescribed checkpoints, then what does that say about the checkpoints themselves? It says they're optional. It says the structure isn't the only way. It says the power that institutions claim isn't divine. It's negotiated. And that, right there, is what makes the self-educated such a threat. They don't argue against the system. They exist outside it. And their existence is enough to shatter the illusion of necessity. That's why society works so hard to delegitimize them. They're called amateurs, outsiders, unqualified, not because they lack skill, but because they lack obedience, not because they're ignorant, but because they're unlicensed. The message is clear. You didn't kneel at our altar, so your knowledge is invalid. Your insight is irrelevant. Your success is a fluke. But the truth is harder to swallow. The truth is that self-educated individuals carry within them the most subversive idea of all. You are allowed to know. Without a diploma, without a title, without a supervisor nodding in approval. You are allowed to see clearly, to speak freely, to live meaningfully, on your own terms. And that's the real reason the elite hate them, because they are living reminders that freedom of thought is still possible. That power is not always earned. It's often inherited, protected, and inflated. That influence doesn't need to be granted from above. It can rise quietly from within. And when that happens, when enough people stop waiting to be approved and start building their own understanding, the system doesn't just lose control, it loses credibility. But here's the part they never tell you. Being self-educated doesn't just set you apart, it often sets you alone. Because when you stop playing by the rules, people stop knowing how to place you. You no longer fit the categories they're comfortable with. You're too curious for the conformists, too skeptical for the loyalists, too real for the actors. You become unsettling, not because you're trying to be, but because your presence reminds people of the questions they've buried, the truths they've postponed, the parts of themselves they've silenced to belong. And so the distance begins, subtle at first. Fewer invitations, awkward silences, the polite but unmistakable message. You make people uncomfortable. You're too direct, too intense, too reflective. You see too much. You say too much. You ask what no one else wants to answer. And slowly, society starts pushing you out to the margins, not with violence, but with indifference. With that quiet exile that says, "We don't hate you, we just don't know what to do with you." And it hurts. Of course it does, because the self-educated don't reject community. They crave connection. They just refuse to lie for it. They refuse to trade clarity for comfort. They refuse to pretend that shallow conversation is enough when they know deeper truths are waiting. Machiavelli knew this kind of exile well. He spent much of his life dismissed by the very elites he once served. His brilliance was only truly appreciated long after his death. When society was finally ready to face the uncomfortable truths, he had seen too clearly, too early. He once wrote that men are more inclined to hate those who make them feel ashamed than those who harm them outright. And isn't that what the self-educated do, without even meaning to? They reflect back the compromises others have made. They make people see what they've chosen not to question, and for that, they are labeled arrogant, cold, elitist, even when their hearts are full of sincerity, humility, and hunger for truth. But let's be honest, greatness has always been misunderstood in its own time. The people who dare to think independently, who dare to reject the script and write their own, rarely get applause while they're alive. They don't get celebrated, they get doubted, silenced, forgotten, until one day, long after they're gone, someone picks up their words and says, "Why didn't we listen sooner?" So if you find yourself walking alone right now, questioning, doubting, observing what others ignore, know this: your solitude is not a weakness. It's the echo of your strength. It's the sign that you have chosen truth over popularity, depth over noise, freedom over comfort. And that's not something to run from. It's something to carry with pride. If you are someone like this, don't fold yourself to fit into smaller spaces. Don't shrink your thoughts to make others feel safe. Don't pretend you don't care when you care too much. Instead, stand tall. Be who you are. Build the world you believe in. One thought, one insight, one bold question at a time. You were not meant to echo the world. You were meant to challenge it. So let's bring this full circle. The self-educated aren't hated because they're dangerous. They're hated because they're free. And freedom, real freedom, is always a threat to control. Machiavelli understood that power only lasts as long as people believe they need it. That rulers only rule when subjects forget they have minds of their own. That obedience is not enforced through chains, but through dependency. And that's what the self-educated disrupt. They break the illusion of necessity. They prove that insight doesn't come from a certificate, that understanding doesn't need a syllabus, that truth doesn't require a sponsor. They learn because they're hungry. They see because they refuse to look away. And they speak because silence to them feels like betrayal. So if you are one of these people, if you've ever been made to feel like your questions are too much, your thoughts too inconvenient, your hunger for truth too intense, let me tell you something that no institution will ever say. You are not the problem. You are the beginning of the solution. Because every time a self-educated mind refuses to be tamed, the world shifts just a little toward real freedom. Keep learning, but not to impress, not to perform, not to collect badges from broken systems. Keep learning to stay free, to stay awake, to stay you. Because once you know that you can learn without permission, think without approval, speak without endorsement, there is no going back. And more importantly, there is no need to. This world needs you. Not the edited version of you, not the version that fits someone else's box. The real you, the one who sees clearly, feels deeply, thinks boldly, speaks carefully, and questions everything. Because your questions are not noise. They are the first whispers of a better world. And if society tries to silence you with labels, with cold shoulders, with veiled contempt, let that be your signal. The discomfort you cause is not a flaw, it's a clue. You're getting close to something real, so keep going. If you've ever felt judged, dismissed, or underestimated for being self-taught, know this: that discomfort you cause is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's the clearest proof that you're on the right path. Because self-education is not a rebellion, it's a return to freedom.